All right. All right, so we have a very simple markup page that has a couple things going on. If we look at our developer tools, we can quickly take a look at what's going on here. We have an HTML document with the doc tag. We have our header. We have a body element. We have a couple of things going on here. We have a H1 tag, 3 paragraphs with some content. And now we want to add some style to it. So what needs to happen is inside of our header tag, we need to have a style tag. We can also have a style sheet in there, but we have a tag. So let's start doing some things with this. All right, question, go ahead.
Yep, so you did mention that we have to add the style tag within the header tag, but I noticed that it's possible to still do the styling without placing it accurately there. So is this like a best practice, or what is like the hidden logic behind placing it specifically in that particular place? Thank you.
Okay, of course, yes. So we never really got to that, but you could actually, so in our cascade, if we were to go back in our slides here at some point, we had those rules, right? We had the rules back here where we said the default browser, the author style, which could be a style sheet, but within our rules, there in here, we'll say the browser default, external style sheet, the internal style sheet, which is in the header, the head tag, or inline on the element itself. So what that means is, you're right, you don't need the style tag. You could actually say, sorry, when I say, you could actually say, actually code style, and you could give it background color is red, right? If I refresh my browser here, that will work. So to your point, you could go through and put a style tag, and I've seen it many times on every single element, and that's not wrong. That's perfectly fine. So the only problem with that is, so now if we go to refresh, we're going to have 3 paragraphs that have red for the background. The only problem with that is if you have hundreds of lines of paragraphs, you're going to have to go through and change all of those, either doing a quick replace against all of that, or maybe it's more complex. Maybe you have many types of things going on. So the best practice is putting it inline in a header tag, which is the next step. So here's inline to the element itself. Otherwise, it would go within here, and we would start off by saying selector, which is a paragraph. We have an open closed and a, sorry, open parentheses and a closed one. So now we're saying all paragraphs are going to get some attribute. So we might say, okay, we might code or type background color equals to blue. All right, what happened there? I switched. Somehow I closed it, sorry. All right. So let's see what happens there. We save that and go and refresh our page. All right, so what happened is because of the cascading, our cascade rules, it says that it's going to ignore. It's going to ignore this rule set, because the rule says that if it's on the element itself, therefore the priority is greater. So if we were to go and remove this, so now this has no style to it. So this one would win, obviously, because now this one has the higher priority. Right? So now Angular is blue. So we could also do the same thing for all of these and remove all of their tags. So best practice would say that all of the styles should be in a header tag, because you can easily control all the elements of the page in one place.
Mike, so yep, my question was,
Yes.
what if I moved this style open and then style closing element outside of the header. I mean, right now it is in line, or right now it is inside the head block.
Yes.
If I moved it outside, I believe the earlier PDF page that you shared basically said that it has to be, so that is like a best practice, but I believe this will still work, right?
Yeah, this will still work.
Okay.
It is best practice again for the browser to load up those dependencies. Now, this is very common to do that, and you may have, so if you had, say, something like components, like a control, suppose you had a widget that was like a credit card widget or control, it may have inline styles inside of it, but then it gets a very messy code, and ideally this, but don't get me wrong, I've done that many times anyways while I'm working, but the main point is that you can in fact put it into the header tag, but best practice would say, these really should go onto their own files, and then you can manage those files external from the pages themselves. But this, for our lab, for what we're doing, is perfectly fine, but just note that yes, you can in fact have the style in the body, but the best practice is probably the header tag. And in fact, the best practice would be that this would be in its own file, because you may have multiple style sheets, you may have hundreds of styles. All right, there was a question, but again, let me just stop sharing it for a second. Interval approach is very, all right. Well, what is the style code for Mandarin? I would not know, to be honest. That is a good one. I wouldn't know. Sorry, Martin. My Mandarin and this is very, I need to research that myself. The style for Mandarin, I imagine if you were coding in Mandarin, what would be the styles? I think you need a snap-in or some kind of editor that is geared towards this.
That's okay.
Yeah, I think, again, we're dealing with North American tool sets. Microsoft is obviously Visual Studio Code, but there must be a language. There must be a way to set the language in here, and just for Visual Studio Code, that's a good thing to take away, though.
I guess the thing that I want to get to here is that I may use a common code, but it might be used by people in different parts of the world. So I want the user to see his own language versus English or whatever. I would expect that that language is going to be a style code.
When you're getting into different languages, there's a whole thing called internationalization with there's different ways they do it. When for instance, if I were to work on server-side code, they have something called resource keys, and within these resource keys, you can have a dictionary, and you can target it for English, French, whatever. And basically, what happens is when the browser is set to another defaulted language other than English, the framework will detect, that this is a browser that's running in French language, and therefore it would show those resource keys over the English ones.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, but that's a little bit more like if you do hard-coded inline text like this, it will never be translated. You need a mechanism to provide different international translations, if that makes sense. But that's it's a little bit more advanced. All right, so moving on, if we wanted to then highlight the H1, we have a selector that maybe we're going to change the text to violet or something like that, and then we get that kind of change going on there. And these are very simple selectors. You can have more than one. Maybe inside of this we want the font size to be larger, and maybe we want this background color to be black. So that that looks like that. So again, we are just targeting these elements here. It can be a button, right? And we can add a button as well. Button that has an attribute that is an ID. This is called my button. Not to forget the name is also my button, just because the form may need that. And we have some text that says click me, right? So we could also change. So right now it has that default agent, and that's how it looks. It's gray. Of course, you can add style to it. Maybe we have more than one button. And eventually we're going to have a problem where, you know, we want the different elements to appear differently. Maybe we don't want all the paragraphs to be blue. Maybe we want only the first one to be blue. And when we get in that scenario, then we have to use selectors even more. Otherwise, we have a page that is very generic and kind of bland, right? So click me 1 and click me 2, right? All right, so we have a situation where eventually we're going to want some different styling across all of these elements, and not, we don't want a generic one. A generic one would be, okay, give me all the paragraphs and turn them blue, but for our web page, we may not want that. So we would have to have different ways to select the different elements in the page. So we'll continue on with selectors, okay? All right. So also one thing to note is we will talk about, okay, so we talked about the syntax, but you may need to put comments in there, and we already talked about comments in HTML. You may also have CSS comments. These comments are used to explain the code. It may help you when you edit the source code at a later date. Comments are ignored by browsers. Just don't put any keys in there that are very important. As I mentioned, a CSS comment is placed inside the style element and starts with the slash star and ends with the slash star. It's much different than the HTML comment that is open and closed in a different way. Again, attention to detail. You know, when you open something, you need to close it. It doesn't matter if you're working on C#, Java, HTML, CSS, whatever language it is. If you open something, you know, you have to be mindful of closing it. In higher level languages, there's so many parentheses that you need to really have an editor to keep track of closing all the nested code. So this is an example of a single line comment. This is a single line comment. This is inline as well, and then you can actually add a multi-line comment as well to that. So you can use a combination of HTML and CSS comments. So here we have our HTML documents, then we have a nested comment here that is within the style tag, and then we have the HTML comment right there. So let's see if we mix and match those, what happens. So let's quickly go to our code here and first we'll put a HTML comment. All right, this is an HTML comment. If I type fast, it's because I have years of experience of typing. I don't really have to look at my keyboard anymore. So imagine that. That's been 10 years of this. All right, this is a CSS comment. All right, so if I do this, chances are the HTML compiler or the browser is not going to know what this is, so it's going to display it as text. We refresh it, you're going to see it's inline there, and that's not what we want. So the browser just thinks this is text. However, if we move this away from here and we put this into the CSS block, it should be ignored. So now you can tell just in the editor itself, the editor itself is kind of highlighting it a different color. It's basically saying that it is ignored. So I go back and refresh my page. you can see it's ignored. Now, look at this in the browser. It is actually kind of revealing it though. So sometimes they say, yes, the browser will not show some of these comments, but still, when we look at the markup, because most likely I have a file that's local to my dev environment, when you go to a public server, the browser again may behave differently. So the point is, don't put anything very important that could reveal some security information within your comments. Make them generic so that developers can read them. And if somebody would happen to read them, it's not very it's not an invasion of the organization's security, I would say. All right, so that is kind of growing our page here, and we'll get to that in a second. Let's look at some questions here. How to change color for a particular line in the paragraph. Right, so if we wanted to, I guess you're saying if you had a lot of text inside of this. All right, if we had React is the greatest. If we had multiple lines of text, you know, really what would happen is you would have to wrap it in a nested element. So you maybe would have a span tag. So a span tag, you would be able to give it a nested element to say React is the greatest. This language is written by Facebook. So then you would use a nested tag. So now when I have a nested tag, now I have a span element here that is within my paragraph that now I can kind of target now this nested tag. So I could say all span tags, you know, maybe I want them to have a bold font, you know, so I want to be bold. If you want to get deeper into the selection, you can definitely get deeper into how, like these selectors that I'm showing you are very, you know, high level, but you can really target, you can get very, very specific in how you target elements in the tree. And this is, and we'll get into that. Let's move on to selectors. Let me just grab that question there. Even if, so the question is, even if an external CSS or JavaScript that's loaded comments will show up in the source tab in DevTools, right? There's potentially that, I assume that my comments that I write could potentially be visible, and I do not put important information into the comments. That you know, developer comments is perfectly fine, but like I said, keys, like certain keys, there's different software tools that can protect the keys from, like if you had a key to a database, a key to a web service, a key to API, a key to like Azure storage, something that somebody can grab and use. There's ways of protecting that, and really bad practice is putting those API keys in your source code. Don't do that. Expect that whatever you put in the comments, somebody could potentially see it. So just keep that in mind when you are writing code, just for a best practice. All right, so we've been really kind of dancing around selectors, and selectors is really what is at the heart of CSS. And there's different ways to do this. We've been only really talking about one way, but we want to talk about selectors are used to find the elements in the tree that you want to style. Remember, we have the concept of the document object model, which is the DOM tree, and we need ways of traversing and selecting those nodes. So we use something called selectors. CSS is so good at selecting that they have written a whole library called jQuery, which is quite older, but it does the job really well. And it is very good at selecting the tree and applying styles and different actions that even the newer frameworks, even though they shouldn't be, they still, I've seen, still use jQuery, which is over 10 years old now. I'm surprised actually that it's still in the newer projects, but it does a good job. Oh, 1 second. Apologies there. Again, we are getting some requests for roadblocks today on my phone. I don't have my phone, so it's downstairs. All right, so CSS selectors can be set up into 5 categories. The simple ones are the ones that we've basically been talking about. The elements based on the name. Well, we haven't talked about the ID or class, but we've been talking about just the elements where we're selecting across all paragraphs, all span tags. But sometimes we want to get more specific in that, and we may need to use some of these other ones. Just know them. I mean, you may not use all of them, but there's a combination selectors where we can select elements based on a specific relationship between them. Case in point, maybe you have a paragraph that has a child, which might be our span tag, and you need to select that nested tag. Now, this is more advanced CSS, but just be aware of it. For our course, we may not be getting into these other elements of selectors, but like I said before, you can get very, very specific, and you can select anything in the tree. You just have to know how to use these more advanced selectors. So pseudo class selectors. So class selectors we will talk about. There's a way to create a class. When you have a group of styles that you seem to be using all the time, like maybe you have the same style for a purple button, you may need at one point in time to extract those styles out and call it purple button, and it's a class. Because later on your site, you might have a blue button, and you need a way of sharing that style across the entire site. So you can group all of your key value pairs into something called a class. And that's one way that you can use. And you can not only apply the classes across all elements, but you can also select all of the elements that have that class, if that makes any sense. So pseudo element selectors select and style a part of an element. And then there's attribute selectors that can select elements based on attribute or value. So these are the different ones. We will definitely be looking at the ID, the class, the grouping, and the universal ones, and we'll look at each example of each one. The first one that we've been working on already is the element selector. This is a straightforward one. It selects the HTML element based on the name. So for our example, we were using paragraph, the paragraph element. So we would write a style that says all paragraphs, we're going to align them to center. We're also going to make them red, all of the text red. So what that would do is look at a very simple page here, and it will extract all of these paragraphs and apply that style. Now, there is a little kind of hint in here that this paragraph is a little different. This paragraph has an ID. So it's different than these two. It actually says that this is paragraph 1. So if there is no other style in there that targets that ID, then this will be applied to every single one. However, there is a selector that can actually target this ID, which is called an ID selector. But we don't have that example now. We just have the example where here, all the elements in the page that have a paragraph will be center aligned and have a red text. Right, that'll be center aligned and red text. So that would be similar to what we had already done here. All of our paragraphs will be blue, right? In our example. In our example here, all of our paragraphs will be blue. If we wanted to highlight them, we would select our element to inspect these paragraphs. So we would have this one here. And then in our dev tools, we can see the style. And here is where we could actually modify the styles in the live. And so we see that within the page, there's a paragraph color to blue. That's the user style. Sorry, that's the author style. If you see this thing here says user agent style, that's what the browser, the default style of the browser, which we may want to overwrite. You know, we may want to overwrite those inlines, those user agent styles. So we can actually toggle this and see what it would look like out of the box, apply the style. If we wanted to overwrite some of these things, we could in fact, you know, change some of these margins, however we want our paragraphs to look. And it doesn't have to be paragraphs. It could be our button, how our button would look. So if we selected our button, we could see out of the box that the browser has this whole style for boxes, right? It makes it gray. It has this kind of, all of these different attributes. To be honest, I don't know them all. I'd have to go and look at them all. But there's certain things that we might want to change. Like we might want to change the color. We might want to change the border. We might want to get a prettier button. So we would overwrite these styles at some point. So let's do that. Why not? So if we have a button and we say, all right, we want the border radius. So that here's something, and we want it to be, I don't know, 2 pixels. So let's see what that does. All right, it added, if you notice, it added some type of bevel to it. You can see there that it added a border, kind of beveled it a little bit. Maybe we don't like that. Maybe we want a little bit greater bevel or some kind of radius on that button. And let's see what that looks like at 5 pixels. So now we got a little bit of a rounded edge to it, right? And if we look at, so if we look at the style sheet there, you know, maybe the beveling, there is no property there, so we didn't overwrite it. But maybe if we said, okay, let's look at the border width. The border width is 2 pixels. So let's, in our style, let's say border width is going to be 5 pixels, and we're going to save it. When we refresh it, you can see now the border is a lot greater. If you notice now, we have the border width and the radius that can be removed. But if we look at the user agent of the browser, through our cascading rules, now this has been canceled out. It lost. The border width has lost. Now the precedence is on the style itself, right? The style itself, because we applied it to all buttons. If we actually, in fact, put a style on, say, this button here, style, now we're doing the inline element, and we said the border width is 20 pixels. Now this is going to have the most precedence, because in our rules way back here, the most highest priority here is on the element itself. So every other ranking will be lost. We'll lose in the cascade. And this, at the heart of it, is the most tricky thing to understand when you're working with CSS, that in fact, why would this style look like that? Why would it win? And you would have to inspect the element to say, okay, well, all these other buttons are getting the class applied. Why is this one button, maybe it's not on this page, but maybe it's somewhere in my website. Maybe some developer put the style directly on it, and then that's bad practice because they're not getting the global style applied to that button. So I guess to answer someone's question is, yes, you can put the style directly on the element, but I would say it is bad practice if you're using classes, and because unless it's a very specific case, you might want, you know, most of your elements in your website to have a generic look. You don't want to have different components looking different across the site. It makes for a bad user experience. But anyhow, that's a little bit of the ranking. So, and if you notice here, we're just using straight up element selectors here. So we have to look at what other selectors are there. And the heart of CSS is really selectors. So let's go back to this. We talked about the element selector, which is the one that is most probably straightforward. So we can then get into the ID selector. So we noticed back in that other example that we had a different paragraph and it had an ID. And we might have mentioned that it's very good for some elements to have IDs. You may have cases where you have a generic paragraph, but in the example of a form, a user form, you may need to persist some information from that form to collect the data. So in that case, you would need an ID. You know, you would need the input box to a credit card number to say credit card, or have a unique identifier that says credit card number, credit card expiry date, credit card name holder. And the form needs to know about those IDs. Otherwise, the data will be persisted it'll be wrong. You'll have the expiry date in the credit card number and vice versa, and the database will not know the difference. So it's good to have IDs on some of those important elements. And the good thing about that is there's a CSS selector for the IDs. So if you wanted to get very specific, you could target that particular element that has a unique identifier, which is very exact. So the ID selector uses this ID attribute of the HTML element to specify a specific element. The ID is always unique, which is what an ID is. It's a unique identifier. So the selector will be used to select one unique element. So if you write some type of style, and if you notice, this select element with the ID starts with a hashtag. So it's a differentiation. It's a little bit different than the element style, because when the compiler and when the browser sees a hashtag, it says, okay, now I'm looking for a specific ID, not just a general element. So the hash character tags it so that the browser knows it's looking for an element with the ID of para1. So then it will search the tree and find this element and only apply this style to that specific element. So it's very, very, very exact. And the CSS rule will be applied to this. So in terms of ranking, let's try it. Maybe there will be, let's try it. So we have, in our example here, we have 3 buttons here. But the problem is this style is being applied to all buttons. I don't want that. I want a very specific button. Let's just say this is, I don't know, this is a Facebook button. This is a like button, right? And we want to target that like button because we want it to act differently. So we're going to target this ID. In this example, to be honest, these might as well not even have any IDs because they're just generic buttons. So you could actually look at this example like they are just elements and they have no way of distinguishing between the two, except this one has an ID. So this one itself could in fact be targeted. So we could actually have a style here that says hashtag like button. Now I'm targeting that element exactly. And we want to give it a background color. I don't know, we're going to say this one is purple. Why not? Purple. So if we refresh the page here, now we see that this ranking of our styles, you know, this one is now exact. It probably applied all these styles, but then it also applied the background color to it as well. So I think there's a question somewhere here. How to change the color for, Can different elements use the same ID? No. In fact, what might happen is, let's try it. You know, let's see what happens. Let's say, let's code the fact that we're going to take this like button and we're going to apply it to this. Sorry, we're going to apply it to this paragraph. Let's see what happens. And we refresh our page. now what happened is it doesn't throw an error, but now we are getting a result that we don't want, because the paragraph is not a button, but it has an ID similar to it. So the browser will allow you to do that, but the best practice is more on the developer, in that every element should have its own unique identifier. However, in big projects, this is a common bug. It can be a very common problem too. However, best practice would say every element that you want to target should have its own unique identifier, but the browser is not going to bark at you. So that we have that going on there. All right. Can different elements use the same ID? Got it, thanks. Okay, yes, they can. All right, so let's get back to the selectors. All right, we got, let's try to make our way through this. All right, so there's an example here we wanted to look at. I think we looked at this one. So this one is just saying that, same example, we have a paragraph that has a hashtag and has paragraph 1, and we're applying this key value pair of text element centered, and we're calling it red, and it's targeting this right here. All right, so that's basically what we just went through. So that's all right. All right, next slide. So that's the ID selector. So we can also have a class selector. We already talked about this. The class selector selects HTML elements with a specific class. So the point is with this is you may have a lot of common styles out there that you may want to encapsulate inside of a specific class that can be used, like in the button example, we can apply it across our entire site. So this is a little different now. Instead of the hash, we have a period. So that tells the compiler that now we are dealing with a class, a group of styles. And it will know that this center class, when applied here, so imagine this should actually be called red text. That's a bad example, but imagine this, if this was center, this would be class is center, but this should actually match up with the class, right? So in this example, this would not be applied. I would have to go back and rename this to red text, and then that would be applied to all elements. All right, let's look at that example here. If you could just mute your mics, please. I think I can hear some background noise. Thank you. All right, so if we look at this right here, okay, this is the better example. So, all right, let's just say this was red text, and this is called red text. If I go to run this, only one would get that style, because if you notice there, this paragraph now, there is no class called center. I would have to either create a class called center or change this to red text. And now it gets the same style. So it's a way of grouping common styles. If we were to go back to our example, yes, go ahead. Someone has a question.
Hi, Mike. So
Hi.
basically, IDs and classes, all of these are ways to tell the code that this is the particular style that should be avoided. But my question is, and I know the answer is somewhere near the best practices, but why exactly do we need a class if we can do the same sort of a thing with an ID? Why have two different ways of doing the same thing? Are there any other applications of these two that are perhaps not specific to CSS but have different applications in web development that we haven't covered yet? Or
well, it just goes to the point of an ID should be unique to the element. Let's just say you had a form and you put the same ID across the entire input form. When you go to submit that form, you will overwrite everything. If you have critical information, the only thing it will know is the last if you had an ID called data input and the entire form had IDs called data input, it would only grab one value. So your entire user input, the data could never persist. So because of that, each element best practice needs a unique identifier. You would have to, if you had 10 elements, you would have to have 10 styles to target all of those unique identifiers. So it's just better to have a class, because then you can apply the class to the entire form. And then classes can also be, it can be used throughout the site in a generic way. That's one of the real best practices. Usually, yeah, when you're dealing with IDs, ID is very, like, the ID in development is very protected and very important, that the ID is unique. And that even goes from the database level. Like when you talk about IDs, there is only one ID. Because if you had multiple IDs in the database and you go to delete record, ID 10, you could blow away thousands of lines of important data. So, best practice is, unique identifiers.
Thank you. So to recap, ID has a lot or maybe everything to do specifically with the form values.
It's not only that, also identifiers and names could be used for accessibility. Okay, case in point. I was working today on some type of element, some type of a drop-down widget for us. We're doing express pickup, so they need a store. They need a way to select the store, and they need the way to toggle some other kind of checkbox. So the QA person said, "Hey, I need to write my automated tests." So they have a way of automating their tests, so they're not manually clicking this button and clicking that button. They have a way of writing an automated test, so it automates, filling out a form and submitting the form. And the only way that that automation tool works is if it knows that there's unique identifiers on it knows the difference between this button and clicking this button. Otherwise, in that scenario, that whole automated test would fail. And that's just one example. Another one might be accessibility. With those screen readers, those tools look for unique identifiers. So if you were to plug in something in HTML validator or CSS validator, if you had many elements that had the same ID, you would have many errors in the validator, because that is not considered valid HTML. So hopefully that answers that question for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it fair comment to say that the purpose of using a class is to compress the amount of code and to make your code much more robust?
Yes.
So it doesn't take thousands of people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, because you could, bad practice would be copy pasting. Okay, so a bad practice would be this. Okay, so I'm going to write, I'm going to give these a couple of IDs. This is called whatever. This will be Facebook, whatever. This will be Facebook button. This would be Google button. I want them all to look like the like button. So, bad practice would be, okay, I'm going to copy this. Okay, I'm going to copy this. I like that style, so let's copy this 3 times. And let's target each one of those, right? And, maybe there's a lot more styles in there. And, but I'm going to copy this in every single page I have, not just this page, but every other page I have. And then it gets really, it's a lot of code. So it's better just to say, okay, well, I'm going to just create a class called purple button. And I'm going to take this out. And now, okay, if you're with me here, so what that means now is I don't need any of these anymore, because I can just apply all of these against the class. So I can just say class equals purple button. And I can apply them across all buttons right now, regardless of the name. These should all get that class. If I so desired, I could also have a red button in there if I wanted to, but now they're all purple. So it was just a way of kind of grouping that together. All right, 2 people, go ahead. Do you have some questions? Thank you for raising your hand, though, by the way. If you want to open your mic, you can. Otherwise, I have to look at the chat window.
Yeah, hi, Mike and Natasha here. So just a couple of bit, like my 2 cents on the ID thing, what I've observed in my experiences, generally companies do have their own themes for their own websites. And they sometimes like to change those themes. Let's say there's an LGBTQ event, they want to make like everything in some other shade, or something is happening, a subdivision has come up, they have a new theme or whatever. And generally websites just adopt those themes mostly, but if you have IDs used in your styling, there is going to be a lot of rework required to kind of make sure that the theme shows up correctly and all of that. So code maintainability perspective also, it's really tough to have IDs handled all the time, especially in like big legacy like websites which are going on for years and years.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Yes, yes. Yes, exactly. If you have style sheets that are based on IDs and you need to swap out a new style or move a component, there's a lot of, yes, there's a lot of technical debt, you would say. There's a lot of rework. So yes, to your point, it's easier to have a style that's a class. When you start mix and matching IDs, that's very, very specific. And it's like, there's just a lot of maintenance. Like, we're only dealing with a small page, and I know for some of you maybe this is a lot too, but when you look at these very big sites like Netflix, like you're dealing with thousands and thousands of lines of code here. If you really look at this kind of site and really dig into a site like that, what it really looks like is there's a lot of code in there if we really were to dig into all of that. And you can see they're using classes here. If we look at this, they have an ID, they have a whole bunch of classes. You can use multiple classes on each element. Spend some time and look at one of your favorite sites and see how they construct their pages, and even go further, look at their styles, look at their style sheets, or just poke around. Sorry, I can't see the comments, but anybody else have a question before I continue? All right, silence is golden, I believe. All right, so that is the class selector. All right, I think we're coming up to 45 minutes, but let me just finish these slides and we'll continue on. So that's the class selector. Very important, especially when you have UX designers. They love to work with classes, best practice, to give them the flexibility of swapping out sheets very easily, and not having to deal with changing IDs and the unique identifiers element IDs. All right, so we have this class selector, but you can also get even more specific than that. So this is more advanced CSS, but I'm trying to show you that you can dig deep into some of these things. So here we need to make a note is that a class name cannot start with a number. It needs to be all alphabetical, right? Sorry, not alphabetical. It needs to be characters, not numbers. So you can't have 5 center, 5 align. It has to be center. So you can also specify that only specific HTML elements can be affected by a class. HTML elements can also refer to more than one class. So here we are saying that I'm going to grab all paragraphs. I'm going to select all paragraphs that have a center class applied. So this is really the power of the selectors. If you ever learn jQuery, this is why it's so good. It basically does the same kind of thing. You can actually, from that DOM tree, not only select the paragraphs, but select the paragraphs that have, say, a large class applied to it. And that's very powerful. So just know that you can actually do that 1 level deep, 2 level deep. Like when we start talking about selectors, there are ways to work down the descendant tree of that, if that makes any sense. It's very powerful. All right, so let me just go back to that. Right, let me just go back to that. Let me see that for a second. Did I have an example on that one? Class selector, I can think we went through that one. This is another one that's actually, so this one is really powerful. I haven't really seen it used too much, to be honest, because it basically just says, take everything on my entire page and just turn it blue and center align it. And this is kind of dangerous because it's global, it's universal, but it basically is this asterisk, and then it has the open close tag, and it's basically saying every single element in my entire page. What would be even worse is if this was, it could be used in a very specific way. If you had a global style sheet, maybe you wanted to enforce a certain kind of font on your website to be Geneva or whatever font that is, right? Helvetica. I even said it wrong. Arial. There could be a reasoning for this, but it basically says everything. It's like all or nothing, right? So universal selector. I don't use this one much, but just know about it. So another, to the point of let's condense our code a little bit. This is a way to do it. And I don't want to get too deep into selectors because they can get very confusing. But when you get good at them, you can group things really well. But just know that instead of duplicating code here, we can group them all. So this looks like a lot of code here, this definition. They all have the same definition. They all text align to center. They all set the text to red. So there's really no point of having 3 when we can do them all in one line. So we can group all the selectors, and we have to separate each one with a comma. And then that is the equivalent of this. Yes, go ahead. Someone has a hand raised. Yes.
Suppose we have H1, H2, and H3. If we did something like H star and then started coding the style part, will it work? If we, in the previous example, we simply had a star and it applied that styling on every element on the text. But if we did like H and then star, will it apply on all heading rule sets?
Let's try it. Let's try it.
Okay.
It all comes down to the, it all comes down to how the cascading rule set goes, right? So let's see here. So I'm going to say universally, I'm going to set everything to a black background. And I'm going to save that. I'm going to see, well, actually we have a couple things that are black. So let's just write pink. And let's just see if the ranking happens, what happens, right? So it didn't, right? I guess the ranking said universally, let's give every element, which is the body and any text, we're going to give it pink. But I guess as we're going down to the specific element in the ranking rules, it's saying, okay, well, this is universal, but I'm cascading down to the element itself. And I'm saying that these are getting higher precedence. But if we had an ID or a style on the element itself, it would probably overwrite it. So I guess that answers our question, right? We have to try it. But it looks like in the rule set, in the rankings, that the universal selector is not all powerful. It can lose the ranking battle. But good question there. Thank you.
Yep. So actually, this is also like a very good outcome. But my main question was, if suppose we have another paragraph named H2, then is it possible perhaps to apply a styling that is named as H and then star? instead of doing like a combined for H1 and H2?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. There is a way to, maybe not exactly with star, but there is a way to mix and match these styles. That's kind of getting into a little bit more advanced selecting. It's ringing my bell. It's reminding me of jQuery. Like there is a way to start selecting more specific things.
Perhaps like a pattern matching based upon the class name. So if there's like a specific product on a website, then all the elements or all different classes coming under it would have like one common style element. So perhaps something related to that.
Yeah, there's so many ways to style. There's so many ways to select. To be honest, you know what? Honestly, when I'm dealing with some of this stuff, I go to Stack Overflow and be like, okay, how do I select the descendant class that like this is all what jQuery is all about. And yeah, it's only through, you know, the specific example I'd have to play with it, to be honest. But there are ways to get at what you're trying to get to, if that makes any sense. But not to confuse everybody else. I know that's a good question, but you know, for our purposes, we're gonna just we're gonna know about these things, but just know that how powerful it is, and know that we can do these things. But we're gonna just stay at this top level for now. It's a lot to grasp. I realize that. So grouping, we got 2 more slides. Take a break. So just to go over these simple selectors, we have the class selector. We have ID selector. The star is a universal one that selects all the elements. We have it on the element itself, and we can also group the elements with a comma. Right, so these are the ones that are the main ones to remember. They're called simple selectors. What my friend was referring to is a more advanced selector. And when we get into those advanced selectors, there's many different strategies of mix and matching different things. So that's that. So what I'll do is, I think that was, geez, I don't know how long that was, to be honest. What was that? Okay. Let me stop sharing at least. Did I? What was the time check there? I was said back at 7:45. I went to 9 already. Wow, time flies. My God, I'm sorry. That was like an hour and 15 minutes. But it was because you guys had good questions. Thank you, because you know, this actually helps. So a couple questions there. Somebody had, can different elements use the same ID? We already talked about that. Are the different CSS defaults for each browser drastically different? Chrome and Firefox have some little differences there, but